Okay, so it is my great honor to introduce Jane Hirshfield, who has long been a hero of mine, who is a poet, a translator, an editor, an essayist, and a wonderful, kind human being. Jane was born in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and by the time she was in first grade, she determined that she wanted to become a writer. And the first book that she bought with her own money was a book of Japanese haiku at the age of 8 with $1. Jane was in the first graduating class at Princeton that included women, where she created an independent major in creative writing and world literature and translation. And the year she graduated, in 1973, she published her first poem in the nation. One might think that after such an early success, one would go on to focus solely on writing poetry, but in fact, Jane turned her primary focus towards Zen practice for the next 8 years at the various centers of the San Francisco Zen Center, including 3 years at Tassajara, the wilderness monastery in California. I myself use Jane's poems frequently when teaching Buddhism, and even tonight, as we might have a particular focus on Jane's engagement with Buddhist traditions of practice and poetry, I want to make very clear that Jane is not simply a Buddhist poet. Her influences include the poetry of Greece and Rome, English sonnets, Horace, Thoreau, Milosz, Szymborska, Whitman, Dickinson, Cavafy, Haas, Neruda, Rilke, Bishop, as well as Chinese poets such as Tu Fu, Li Po, Wang Wei, Han Shan, and Japanese poets. Um, and I should say that Jane's work as a translator and editor has been particularly helpful in bringing awareness to poetry written by women, including The Ink Dark Moon and Women in Praise of the Sacred. Both texts I have used a lot, and many of my friends have used a lot. Um, and also, very important to me, Jane's poetry is deeply informed by and responsive to an engagement with ecological awareness and the natural sciences. She's been a poet in residence at the Andrews Experimental Forest in Oregon and at a neuroscience research program at University of California, San Francisco. And she also founded Poets for Science, which is a traveling interactive exhibit of science. And I should say that if you're familiar with Jane's work, you know that in the last 10 years or so, her work has taken on more and more urgency in response to political and ecological crises. She's published a number of books of poetry, 2 books of essays, as well as her works as editor and translator. And maybe after this introduction, just to settle us into the actual poetry, Jane, if I could invite you to read a poem, Meeting the Light Completely, which we shared with participants when they registered for this program.
Yes. Thank you so much for that very broad introduction to my work, and for choosing this particular poem as the one for people to see. I'm sorry about all the light, by the way, but it's appropriate for this poem, I suppose. I have a skylight and the sun is just hitting it and me, and nothing I can do about that. Meeting the light completely. Even the long beloved was once an unrecognized stranger. Just so, the chipped lip of a blue glazed cup, blown field of a yellow curtain, might also, flooding and falling, ruin your heart. A table painted with roses, an empty clothesline. Each time the found world surprises, that is its nature. And then what is said by all lovers, what fools we were not to have seen. I suppose that poem is in a long tradition of poems that ostensibly are about the love between one person and another, but also carry messages about Buddhist understanding and practice. When I was at Tassajara, such poems were read as teaching poems. And this poem always had, given the title especially, it always had that dual meaning intention to it.
Great. Thank you, Jane. So I want to come back to that poem a little later because it has a quality that you have written about a lot, the quality of surprise or turn or seeing differently, which I think is very important to you and your work. But maybe we could start with how you developed your early interest in East Asian literature and art, and what role that played in your coming to Buddhism.
Well, as you said in the introduction, I was drawn towards poems with a Buddhist worldview before I could have possibly understood either the poem or the worldview. All I knew was, I was 8 years old. I went to the stationery store on First Avenue and 20th in New York, and there was a spiral display at the front. And I looked at all the little books, and the one that I wanted to take home was Japanese haiku. I cannot fathom what a child who had grown up in totally urban circumstances and who could not have really parsed what the poems are actually talking about. Haiku is just an infinite field of deeper and deeper understanding of thusness and of momentary revelation. But maybe I understood something was missing from my life, that the birds and the crickets and the frogs and the exposure to rain and sun and heat and cold that urban life so cushions you from. Maybe I knew something was missing, and I was drawn towards that. And I was drawn towards what I could not understand. And so, from the start, inexplicably, um, the poetry of Buddhist understanding called my name. And then when I was in college, I took, Chinese poetry in translation, Japanese literature in translation, Japanese no drama in translation. And that body of work is steeped in Buddhist understanding. And from that, I understood that this was in accord with how I experienced the world, how I felt the world. And, as we all know from R.H. Blythe's Zen in English literature, these understandings are not confined to people who even know the word Buddhism. I took Latin in high school, and the Epicurean and Stoic poets with their carpe diem, that is a call to live in this moment. Wordsworth is full of Buddhist recognition of transience and of the numinous saturation of this moment. So everywhere I came across something that resembled practice, I was drawn to it. And a friend had the early copy of Tassajara bread book, and in those days, on the inside back cover, there was a copy of the monastic schedule, and that was how I knew there was a Zen monastery in America. And I had no idea that, so shortly after graduating college, I would be driving down that 14-mile mountain, perilous dirt road, because I was curious, because I wanted to know, was there something here that I needed to know? And it turned out there rather was.
I'm curious, Jane, if you feel like coming to Buddhism through the poetry and the literature has led you to a different kind of practice than coming to the doctrine. I sometimes think, there's some people who think that poetry or Buddhist poetry takes concepts and illustrates them in pictures, but I also often wonder if it isn't the case that Buddhist teachings aren't first and foremost understood or illumined through picture thinking, and then after the picture thinking, conceptualized as doctrine, which is a very different way of engaging with Buddhist teachings. And I'm curious if, coming from the literature, if you feel that's made a difference for you.
Well, I think it made an enormous difference. And in fact, in college, I'm embarrassed to admit this because I had no idea what a wonderful translator it turned out he was of the great Japanese poet Saigyo. But I signed up for a Mahayana Buddhism course and I dropped it because I knew that I was a good student all my life, and I knew that I did not want to be a good student of conceptual Buddhism. I didn't at that point want to know about the different schools and the theory of this and the theory of that. So that Zen is what drew me. Makes sense not only because it was the only Buddhist monastery in America at that point, but also because Zen is so much the practice of, there are many words and there are many sutras when you are actually doing Zen practice, but the idea of it is that it is the practice outside of books and outside of cognitive mapping. And that is always what drew me. Also, the Buddhism that I was exposed to, especially reading the no plays, was, as it turned out, probably the only Buddhism I would have been drawn to, in that it was a practice that included the whole human life. It was not only that it was Mahayana practice, but it was a particular version of Mahayana practice in which a person could still fall in love and practice. A person could have a full human life. Lay practice was recognized. And so the figure of Ono no Kamachi, one of the two women who I co-translated many years later in the book, The Ink Dark Moon, she held for me a model of what practice can look like if you are not giving up normal life. She was supposed to be the most beautiful woman of her time. That was actually because she was the greatest poet of her time. Japanese ideas of beauty are not about bone structure so much. But she ended her life a forgotten old woman in a thatch rooftop, living alone in the mountains, and people maybe knew that she'd ever written, something, but they had no idea that this hag in the mountains was the great, legendary Ono no Kamachi. And so at the end of her life, we have a tanka she wrote. Tanka are a little longer than haiku, 31 syllables, 5 lines instead of 3 in our system. And she wrote a poem, this abandoned house, leaning in a mountain village. How many nights has the autumn moon spent here? And if you know enough about Japanese culture to know that the autumn moon is often the fullness of Buddhist understanding, that abandoned house and her living in it with the autumn moon, having led a fully human life. There are no plays in which she meets Buddhist priests on the trail and soundly, trumps them in Dharma combat. She was just a great figure for me because I never wanted a practice which meant not being a human being, whether as a poet or as a person. That is important to me. For a long time, at Zen Center, so, Soto, not Rinzai, so we don't do, normal koan practice, although those stories were told and thought and felt about. But we were all encouraged to have a question. And my question for many years was, what is the emotional life of a Buddha? Because different traditions in Buddhism have such very different understandings of that. And it was never sorted out and it was never talked about when I arrived in practice. And so all these conflicting ideas about what it was to have emotions were kind of flying around and running into each other. And I thought about that until I came to my own answer of it. And then I started thinking about something else.
So, even as you were looking for a Buddhism that and a practice that embraced the full human life, 3 years at Tassajara was relatively ascetic, bathing in cold water, getting up before 4 each morning. Maybe you could share a little bit about those years, and then in particular, how you understand the relationship of those years of practice to how the process of your writing unfolded.
Yeah. So one of the things that I heard early on, very early after my arrival at Zen Center, was that there are 4 possible ways to be a practitioner of the Dharma. You can be a priest, you can be a monk, you can be a lay person, or there was this 4th thing called tea house practice, which comes from a particular koan in which there's an old lady down the road from the Zen monastery, and nobody quite knows why they like going there so much, but something about the way she pours the tea, something about the way she looks at you when you come in the door. And the abbot of the monastery thought that she was a great teacher. And sometimes the monks would come to test her. And if they came to test her, she would take them behind a rice paper screen and beat them up. But if they just wanted tea, she would serve them their tea. I loved that idea of Buddhist practice, hidden practice, unlabeled practice. The monastery for me, I have always loved that in Buddhism, as opposed to Catholicism, monastic training is seen as a limited period of time, and it is not a failure to leave the monastery. It is a training time, and I was so grateful to be able to have this strict training as something that I could do. It was how I could, practice fully. And I knew when I went to the monastery, the rule then, it might well still be now, is you did absolutely nothing but practice Zen. And so I knew I was not going to write for 3 years. And during those 3 years, one haiku mugged me one morning when I was having coffee before morning zazen on my little cabin porch. And that was the only thing I wrote in 3 years. And I knew I might not be a poet when I came out after stopping that long. But I also knew I would never be much of a poet if I didn't find out what Zen training might offer of what it is to be a human being. And so I figured, well, if I don't write, I'll, whatever I want to do when I leave the monastery will be clear when I leave the monastery. And I didn't worry about it. I just knew I wanted this strict, absolutely, well, you say undistracted training, but of course, distraction does not leave you at the gate of the monastery. Distraction is always available to be your teacher. But I wanted to do this one thing intensely. And 3 years was at that time the longest anybody went for. It has changed. Many people have stayed much longer now. But when I arrived and began my years at Tassajara, 3 years was considered the traditional 1,000 days that one would be there. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I wonder um, if you want to say a little bit more about writing as a practice of attention and the question of writing and practice and poetry as practice,
Yeah.
and maybe also reading as practice. There's a field of exploration around poetry and practice there.
Yes. So for me, it is every part of it has to do with the intention to cultivate an awareness larger than the one you might have had the moment before. And even that comparative language is already to fall a little bit into an error to say larger. But I wanted to find a way to not be afraid of inhabiting my own life. So as a child, that was writing poems, you know, after everybody else had gone to bed. I didn't show my poems to anybody. They were my own life raft for figuring out my own perplexities and griefs and rages and sorrows and even perhaps happiness, my relationship to the culture, all of that, you know. By the time I was in 7th grade, I was writing, and then hiding it under the mattress. I imagine my mother found them now, but I didn't think she did, so who knows. Zen for me has been a practice very much about what can be understood almost beyond or outside of language. For one thing, it brought that city child, that New York City born and bred child, to living in the wilderness with no heat, no hot water. At that time, there was no glass on the cabin windows. Even in winter, there was only plastic. We lived by daylight and dark. We had kerosene lamps. It was the intimate inhabitants of the world as people had lived in it for all of our species' history. And I found out that you can sit with anything and live, you know, physical pain or emotional pain. All of that, when I began writing again, was part of my tool chest as a poet. I was less timid than I had been before. I was more willing to be with myself and others in intimate ways than I had been before. And I knew that if you just pay attention, whatever is troubling you, it will offer some way of changing. And so that also is true of, you know, both practice and poetry are about the transformation of understanding into a new understanding without rejecting the perfection of things as they are or the difficulty of things as they are. And, you know, both of them, it has always felt to me as the left foot and the right foot of my walking. One through words, the other through the concentration of meditation and silence and simply finding out what it is to stay inside awareness. And whatever comes, comes, whatever goes, goes. Reading. You know, again, we are sponges for everything every human being has ever lived. What is the history of world literature, and particularly the poems, other than the record of momentary portrait by momentary portrait of human awareness put into a vessel where it can be passed from one person to another? The same is true, of course, of the koans. The same is true of the sutras. The same is true of Dharma talk. All of those things are, here is how we can be a human being. And you notice what feels narrowing and what feels an expansion, what feels barricading and what feels an increased welcome to permeability of all that we are, sleepy, angry, whatever. Sometimes, you know, bathed in the fire of this oxygen-based burning world, and all its beauty and all of its grief. Both paths for me are ways to invite myself to a deepened attention and awareness. And, reading all the poems of the world, not that, they don't have to have anything to do with practice or Zen or Buddhism. They are instructions in these human lives. And if they are a good poem, for me, the definition of a good poem, it will leave you a little altered, enlarged, more porous, with a greater tenderness towards this existence we find ourselves in with everyone, with all beings amidst our suffering. And, that is as true of a Catholic poem by a Polish poet who might fear hell as it is a poem of Hanshan or Wang Wei or Izumi Shikibu.
I love hearing you talk about poetry, Jane. Um, is there a poem that you would want to read that illustrates in some way some of what you were just saying?
Oh my.
To put you on the spot, I imagine there are many, many, many poems. There's a whole world of poems, but
Yeah.
um,
So I'm going to pick a poem that flashed through my mind earlier. Um, a poem that came out of having been at Tassajara and was written decades after I was at Tassajara. And because you had mentioned the cold water, I think, in your introduction. So I will give this poem. The title makes little sense. It's just the title, A Cedary Fragrance. Even now, decades after, I wash my face with cold water, not for discipline, nor memory, nor the icy awakening slap, but to practice choosing to make the unwanted wanted. So, for me, a great deal of finding how to say what the early 20th century Greek poet Cavafy called the great yes to my life and to existence has to do with how do you say yes to all of it, not only to what you want, but to what you think you don't want. And this poem, first of all, it is literally true. I still do wash my face with cold water, even though my house has hot water. And it's not because I love it. Some people really like leaping into the cold creek first thing in the morning before zazen. I don't like cold water, but I like this practice. And I have learned to make the unwanted exactly what I want in this one way every morning. And that carries over. That instruction carries over. So that's one poem. I could pick out another if you like.
I would like.
You would like. Well then.
Yes.
All right. So from my list of possible poems to read, I will give you one that kind of covers two two of the things you were talking about as areas that we might explore. Science and also, actually, this is hardly separate, but science and the crisis of the biosphere. This is a much more recent poem. It was written during the first summer of the pandemic, or started then. It took me a long time to finish it. But there was an article in the science feature of the New York Times about mosses living in the Mojave Desert, which is not exactly what we think of as the kind of environment that mosses live in. And it was so beautifully written, and the language of it and the photographs of this piece about mosses, I just knew immediately that this was one of those cases of science offering something that was going to let me talk about something else, even though I did not know what the something else was going to turn out to be until I wrote the poem. Certain things, they just leap into your hands. I once read an article about they figured out how protein works, how protein of itch works. And as soon as I read that article, I went, that's going to turn into a poem, and it did. But that's not the one I'm reading you. I'll read the one about mosses. And what it turned out to be looking at was this question of our co-inhabitants with the biosphere, and also a bit the Buddhist practice, the encouragement for not knowing to be all right. Sung Sanim's teaching of don't know mind. So the title is Mosses, the epigraph from the Times, July 29th, 2020. In the Mojave Desert, a translucent crystal offers bryophytes much-needed respite from the heat of the sun. For hypolithic mosses, it seems, 4% of daylight is right. They live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. I think of these mosses and consider, perhaps we too are mosses, evolving to the parch of our self-made Mojaves, unable to bear the full brightness, the full seeing, to recognize fully the Amazon burning, the Arctic burning, the monarch's smoke-colored missing migration. An experiment not meant to last. And yet we found shelter within it. We pondered our lives and the lives of others, thirsted, slept. To the implausible green of existence, for better, for worse, we offered our 4% portion of praises. For better, for worse, our 4% portion of comprehension. So that poem, like so many I have been writing for the last, one could almost say all my life, because of course, I was alert enough a human being when the first Earth Day happened to understand what our dilemma was. It was perfectly clear in 1970 when I was a young woman what we needed to do. That we haven't done it yet is one of the great bewilderments to me of my life. But this poem is about how do you live inside the bewilderment and sorrow and pain of knowing that every time I open my computer, I am contributing to this. The parch of our self-made Mojaves. But the mosses are there, the quartz is there, the desert is there, and somehow, amidst the grief and amidst the activism, which I also, do what I can, the 4% portion of praises, that really matters, because we need to stay in love with this world. No one will work to save what they do not treasure. And so to give one another the gift of beauty, even if it is the unexpected surprise of finding mosses growing in a desert, that is enough to refasten our hearts to existence and counter despair.
Thank you, Jane. I'm curious what you think the role of poetry is there, both in the countering despair and in relationship to the science of ecology and maybe science more generally. C.P. Snow famously argued that there were two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, and the poem you just read seems to embody a counter, exemplify another direction, another way we could think about things. And I'm curious to hear your response.
So C.P. Snow's title, because most people haven't read the book, they've only heard the title, and that sort of conveys the idea of it. It shows you the lasting power of a good phrase, which is exactly what poems exist to create. It is what language used in the compression and distillation of poetry wants to create a memorable phrase which will be useful and continue to come up, whether you're, in favor of it or against it. So if anybody listening wants to hear my thoughts at great length about this, I gave a lecture a couple of months ago, which is up online, called "Making the Invisible Visible: Some Thoughts on Poetry and Science." And one of the sections in there, and it's up on YouTube, it's easy to find, "Making the Invisible Visible," and my name, and it'll pop right up. One of the sections of it was looking at these few powerful phrases that are more poetry than science, that were invented, in their cases, by scientists who were speaking to the general public and changed the world. So I happen to think that the two most consequential words of the 20th century were silent spring. Another, a title, a two-word phrase. You did not have to read the book to understand what lay under silent spring. And, in one way, that is the beginning of this particular era of environmental activism, was Rachel Carson noticing what was happening and then putting it forth in a way where people could feel it fully. Another such phrase was Carl Sagan's nuclear winter, which was so instrumental in calming the arms race, not ending it, but calming it a little, a step back, the way, Northern Ireland has stepped back from the violence of the Troubles. It's such a good example to remember that it is possible for a place where people were bent and terrified into thinking they should kill each other, that can be retreated from. That's worth remembering. And then the third of the phrases that I look at, this is just a tiny section of the talk, less well known, but it was a phrase called the invisible present, and about changes that are too slow to notice because they take place at a different time speed than our eyes. We can see a butterfly, but to see over decades that there are fewer and fewer butterflies, that takes a different kind of awareness. It takes a recording awareness. So that's one small thing that I look at, and where I see, the discoveries of science, we will only make the policy changes at the legislative level and the human changes in our own lives level if we feel their meaning. We must feel their meaning. It's not in the head. It's not logic. Logic might say, it makes no difference whether I use my dryer or hang a clothesline. What difference does that tiny, tiny bit of extra fossil fuel burning make? But if you feel the grief of our changed planet, or if you happen to have lived through one of the days, one of the places where the sky was red all day, or you have been through a hurricane out of season, or yourself been exposed to the tornado or the tsunami or any of the whiplash events, the fires. I live in California. Then you simply don't use the dryer if you can use a clothesline, because you are in love with this earth and you would like to see your children or grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren have a chance to experience it also. in this, even in our diminished times, its immense, enormous, overwhelming beauty. So the other thing poems do is they counter despair and they counter apathy, because they always see that the fabric has two sides. The darkest poem, the bleakest poem, if it is a good poem, it will have a silver thread of beauty running through it, which is enough to make the reader want to open their eyes the next morning rather than not. Similarly, you know, the happy poems, the poems of the great love poems, they always have a little dark thread in them saying, oh, and we're going to die. And, you know, this is the beginning of wisdom, is to always, whatever you are feeling, to feel also the truth of the other side of that. So many of my poems, my early poems, looking at things like global warming. So I wrote a little poem in 2004, not all that early, but, you know, relatively early, titled Global Warming. And what precipitated it was my bewilderment that anyone would not see what was already so visible to be seen. And the poem, I'm going to have to, you know, find it, because I never trust my memory, even though it's a very short poem. It was written with that question in mind. You know, how can people not all be leaping to change our ways? So in 2004, I read this story. It's a true story, comes from Captain Cook's journals, and it was retold by Robert Hughes in his History of Australia. Global warming. When his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up. Unable, it seemed, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. Taking that story, it was like the science stories. I came across the story and I thought, oh, this is going to be useful for something, but what? And I walked around for about a week thinking, what will it help me understand? And then I realized global warming, that the people who could not see it, unable to fear what was too large to be comprehended. You know, that boat, Captain Cook's boat, was so out of scale with anything that the indigenous people of Australia had ever seen that they literally didn't react to it. And they only reacted when small ships were launched off its side to come to shore. And then they sprang into action. So our human minds, our inability to take in what is unfathomable and overwhelming, remembering that brought me from anger to compassion. And that is what I always want for my own understanding of why things are as they are. Because when I feel some compassion, it doesn't end the conversation, but it allows it to move forward with more tenderness, with more softness, with less rage, because nobody wants to be shouted at, and nobody will change their mind because somebody is shouting at them.
Thank you, Jane. I wonder if you'd be willing to read a more recent poem that takes up some of these themes about climate change, about how we live today. And I'm thinking of your poem, Let Them Not Say.
Yes. So let them not say, as I'm looking for it, I'll talk. I wrote it in 2010 when somehow the urgency of the crisis of the biosphere steepened in around 2010. And I wrote it with that in mind and didn't publish it for some years because I thought it had work to do. So, 2014, sorry, 2014. When I finally published it, it went out first as a poem about politics, but now it has returned to being a poem about the biosphere, and it's in some small ways has become something of an anthem amidst activists and projects. Let them not say. Let them not say, we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say, we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say, they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say, it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say, they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. So there is that kerosene lamp from Tassajara, in that the phrase a kerosene beauty. They cast a beautiful light. We didn't know then what we were doing, burning so much kerosene. There are solar panels now at Tassajara. But this poem looks at us now from the point of view of the future. That's the them. I am imagining the future, looking back on us and knowing, in 150 or 300 years, did we make it through this pivot point in our relationship to the world, to the planet, to the beings? And it is my hope that the poem will contribute to making itself incomprehensible, that if someone stumbled across it in 300 years, they might think, why was she so worried? Oh, what a silly thing to be so worried. That, it might happen. It might. And if the poem undoes itself from meaning, I will be long dead, but very glad. But we did know. We know enough. And the only question is, will we do enough?
Well, may the poem itself contribute to its becoming meaningless. And thinking of the poem doing that kind of work reminds me of the subtitle to your second collection of essays, 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. You have a whole book about that, and it feels a little unfair to ask you to answer a question that you address in a whole book in a few minutes. I like the phrase, any philosophy that can be put in a nutshell deserves to be in a nutshell. But still, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a few words about how a great poem does transform the world.
Yeah. So a little bit of what I was already saying, poems seduce you into reading them. That is art's job. It is the job of art to draw in a person in a way that leaves them susceptible to transformation. And all art transforms us. A piece of music, you're a different human being after you've listened to it than you are before. Now, the transformation of the world, we have gotten into something of a cultural argument over that, which developed in the course of my lifetime, which was the movement from the idea that change is created by individual people who then convince everybody else to do something differently, versus the idea of structural conditions and structural change. And, you know, I'm old enough that I remember this idea arriving from France, I believe. You are the philosophy teacher, so you would know better than I the actual lineage of it all. But I have always been a little perplexed, a bit like the two culture thing of, you know, why would anybody say that? Clearly, you know, also the scientists I know read a great deal of poetry, and many poets I know love science. So, you know, C.P. Snow made a great case, but it was about university instruction. It was about the curricula of the departments of the sciences and the departments of the humanities. It was not about human beings. It was about university courses and required courses. I was always sorry I never took physics for poets when I was an undergraduate. I should have done. I didn't want to wake up that early. All the science courses started at 8 in the morning. And at that time, I was a late sleeper. But I'm meandering a bit. What was the train track that I just stepped off of?
About great poems transforming the world.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah.
So there we are. Transformation, even structural transformation, where does it live and how does it enact itself except through individual human hearts, minds, mouths, hands, choices, and lives? And so I think, you know, the additional understanding that that brought was indispensable, but I don't think it removes the fact that human beings, one by one, need to change if we are going to transform the world. And a great deal of that transformation does happen in the realm of the arts. Arts are powerful and sticky. They mean to engrave themselves in you and live with you and come to your mind. And so I do think that, you know, the great poems of the world have not made us human. I always thought that Harold Bloom, you know, book, How Shakespeare Made Us Human, invented the human. That's another, you know, I just totally disagree with the premise, because after all, you know, the great tragedies are human. The great poems of China and Japan, long before Shakespeare and ignorant of Shakespeare, are human. It's a galling idea to me. But one by one, over the millennia, from before poems were written down, yes, they teach you how to be human. And because I believe good art increases connection, decreases defensiveness, increases the curiosity for a life that is not your own. You know, what happened to them? How did they become who they are? It warms and softens and makes malleable the fixed ideas, which have also come into us for very good reason. You know, evolution put a lot of things into our species about survival and protection, and one group being necessarily your protector and another group putting at risk what it is you're protecting. None of that is unreal. But art gives you a way to add another way of feeling your life. And so, you know, the translations of the world's poems have increased my understanding all my life of what it is to be a human being. And so I am transformed. And when I am transformed, everything is transformed. Sounds like a terribly solipsistic statement, but when you are transformed, everything is transformed. And when a human being is fixed and frozen in some posture of fear and aggression, nothing is transformed. And so that's how I think, poems and songs and falling in love with the person you're not supposed to fall in love with because your families are at war, and there you have your Romeo and Juliet all over the world. These are how we learn to live together and to have our sense of what do we wish well? Who do we wish well? Grow ever larger. I think art breaks down the narrow fixities of ego, because art is always more chiaroscuro. Its shadows are complex, its light is complex, it's giving you more information than you can possibly parse in a linear sentence. Even the simplest poem is doing that. And so maybe through the arts, as well as through, better batteries, better windmills, more respect for why you want forever plastics not in your drinking water. All of this, every part of it is needed. And I just think, we're all allies. I can't bring a lawsuit to challenge something. I can't invent a better battery, but I can write the poem that maybe the person who invents the better battery feels supported by, feels able to keep trying through much failure, through many dark nights of, technology and or the soul. The arts are there to get you through the dark nights.
Oh, thank you, Jane. I feel like the poem we began with, Meeting the Light Completely, is just about this transformation of our world. What fools we were not to have seen, the lovers say.
Yeah.
Um, and to allow our hearts to be ruined. That's part of what a good poem does, or a
Yes.
great poem that allows us to be transformed. That's why we started with that poem, I think, and why I use that a lot when I teach, because it gets at this way in which our perception can be transformed.
Yeah. And so does, meditation practice, moment by moment by moment. So does falling in love. I think the experience of falling head over heels in love and the experience of mystics immersed in the divine are very close to one another, which is why so much of the great spiritual literature of the world uses the metaphors of love. The Sufi poems are all about the beloved, and the Psalms in the Old Testament. These experiences are a continuity. They're not separate. And maybe that inseparability is one of the things that I find in any good poem. It dissolves your sense of walls between one thing and another. And this is just, this isn't something added by art. This is something that's already in us that art manifests and reminds of.
Mm. So, one of the kinds of poems that you've been including in your recent collections you call Pebbles. And I have really loved reading these. And in fact, my wife and I are taking our kids on a canoe trip next week, and we are planning on writing, each one of us, in a journal that we will
Ooh.
share writing pebbles
Oh,
each
that's
day.
marvelous.
Yes. And I wonder if you would like to maybe read one or two and then share um,
Yeah.
what pebbles mean to you and how you think about them, and then maybe share a couple more. And partly what I'm thinking about is I imagine there are a number of people who are with us tonight who are, already writing poetry, and some maybe who might be looking for
Hmm.
an invitation to make this part of a daily practice, as we are hoping to do with our children. And Pebbles might be like haiku, an easy way in for a daily practice. So maybe you could say something about that.
Well, thank you. So I'll read you a couple first, and then I'll say something about it as you invited. Like moonlight seen in a well. Like moonlight seen in a well, the one who sees it blocks it. It's a good Zen poem. Mountain and mouse. Both move, one only more slowly. And that is also, of course, deeply true. One of my science research friends in my close circle is a geomorphologist, and whenever we take a hike, he's always showing us how the movement of the mountains is creating, you know, the gullies and the swells and the cascades and the creeks and all of that. Everything has two endings. Everything has two endings. A horse, a piece of string, a phone call. Before a life ere, and after. As silence is not silence, but a limit of hearing. So what does pebble mean? A pebble is absolutely not a haiku. Haiku have a different feeling to them, a different way of saying, a different enactment. And, you know, the couple of times that I've written haiku, I label them that. This is a little different, but it does share, along with haiku and maybe the four-line poems of classical Chinese poetry, it shares the great love of how much can you say in how little time. I love very brief distilled poems. They have always moved me from those first, you know, haiku that I bought at age 7 or 8. And I'm still interested in exploring how much can you say and how little. And, you know, I write other kinds of poems as well, but I love writing the pebbles because, you know, when I read Mountain and Mouse in a room where there's an audience, everybody laughs, you know, both move, one only more slowly. It's reminding you of the scales of our lives and the scales of change. As silence is not silence, but a limit of hearing. This is also true, you know? So I'm trying to take things that are true in a single perception and pass the delight of that discovery and the feeling of that discovery to someone else. So another one from the same general time period. I run in my books, I put all the pebbles together because it seems rude to the trees to have so many pages with, you know, 3 to 5 lines on them. But they are all independent poems, independently written. Sonoma fire. So I live, you know, I live in California. We have had fires relentlessly for years now. Sonoma is the next county north of me. Sonoma fire. Large moon, the deep orange of embers, also the scent. The griefs of others, beautiful at a distance. So again, you know, the poem is quite literally true. Those deep orange moons are beautiful. The smell of fire, you know, why do people make bonfires when they go to the beach? It's because we are a species that loves the light and the smell and the sound of illumination in the dark. But then if it is your house that is burning, it is not beautiful. And so the poem ended up discovering its way to that recognition. You know, a Greek tragedy, it is beautiful from our distance. If you were the protagonist, there is not much beauty to be felt in living through that. And I wanted to admit that. It's almost an apology for poem writing, that it is from a distance that we are able to make things beautiful, and not to forget that in the center of suffering, there can be only suffering. Sometimes, not always. I have one more that I was going to read, but I think I'd like to save it for the closing poem, since we said I was going to end with a poem. So, you know, pebbles, they are meant to stick in the mind. They are meant to perceive something, but in a way a little different than haiku perceive. And if anybody wants to know, you know, what I advocate about haiku and what makes haiku work, you can either, in that same book, 10 Windows, you know, How Great Poems Transform the World, there's a long essay about Basho, who invented the haiku as we know it, or you can get the same thing online from the big retailer whose name we don't say, for 99 cents as an ebook. It's available both ways. And, you know, I love haiku. I love tanka. I don't write them because I felt like I needed to find my own hybrid rhythms and modes of expression that carry in them both the lineage of East Asian poetics and the lineage of Western very short poems, the fragments of Sappho, the very short poems of Bertolt Brecht, especially the ones written as he was going into exile. They are amongst the great political poems of our era and human poems of our era. The Western lineage of aphorisms. You know, there are many lineages of short poetry from all over the world.
Great. Thank you, Jane. I feel bad we have not gotten to questions from the participants yet, but I have some that I'd like to share.
Okay.
You had mentioned the initial question that you worked with for years was about what is the emotional life of a Buddha? And when you were talking about Sufism and the Song of Solomon, and love, I was wondering if love had something to do with it, but the participant was asking if you had an answer that you might want to share about what you discovered, or is that?
So not necessarily to do with love, but that's a footnote you'd like to add to it. So when and again, you know, this is only my answer, and there are many teachers of Buddhism in many schools of Buddhism who would call this absolute heresy, and, you know, just wrong. But there are some who might agree with me. And you know, there are some koans that agree with me. I came to believe that a Buddha who inhabits a human form will experience what human beings experience. And that my hypothetical speculation is that if you are a fully awakened Buddha, you will still feel all these things. And I think, you know, the Tibetan teaching is closest to this. You will still feel every emotion, but you will feel it not in the service of your own personal narrow life. You will feel it, as I have come to believe the emotions function, they are information. They are telling us something we need to know. And, you know, if we are frightened, they are telling us to look at the circumstance that we are finding frightening. And, you know, it might be as simple as step 6 inches further back from the cliff. You know, it doesn't have to be that somebody else is scaring you. The world is a scary place, and you know, we do lean towards continuing living until we don't. So all of, you know, when I feel a flash of anger reading some news story, what is important to me as a practice person working with the emotions, because after all, that's what the question is really about. It's how do I, as a person of practice, work with these things? A Buddha doesn't have to worry about it. I take that rage or outrage as information that something is striking me here as wrong, and it requires perhaps either my compassion or my actions towards remedy. And that is information you need to have. If nothing ever struck you as outrageous, why would you ever work to save all beings? If you did not feel suffering as suffering, and you only felt the perfection of things as they are, whatever it looks like, the bodhisattva vow kind of disappears. And that can happen. And there's nothing wrong with that happening. It is one way to be in this world, is to truly recognize and praise things just as they are. But for me, so far, at this stage, continuing, it is useful to feel those emotions. Now, love is a hard one. You know, love, let's go back to what I said earlier about the experience of mystical union and the experience of erotic union are very close neighbors. And perhaps opening yourself to one opens you to the other. I would not have wanted a life in which I had been asked to turn my back on Eros. And I was very happy that the examples I found in, you know, the Japanese women's and men's, you know, Buddhist poems and the no plays offered a path where you don't have to do that. So, you know, how can we understand anyone's life if we haven't been through it ourselves? Is there another question?
Yes. So I regularly teach Buddhist retreats that involve reading and writing Buddhist poems. And one of the experiences that I've had is that it's an exhilarating and deeply profound thing for people to write poetry who may not have written a poem since they were in fifth grade. That all of a sudden these deep wells open up, and it's really profound for people. And there's a question about if someone is interested in writing poetry again, and they may not have done that since they were a child, do you have any suggestions for getting on that path again?
I do have a theory that every single human being writes 3 great poems at some point in their lifetime, whether they know they have or not. Because I've had so many friends who don't write poems, don't read poems, don't think about poems, and something large happens to them and they write something and then they show it to me. And it's a great poem. So part of it is just, if words are an expression for you, if words, you know, there are other expressions. There is music, there is dance, there is painting. But if words call your name, simply open outward and start writing what you see and what you feel. Open outward and inward at the same time. This is all very abstract. Take William's retreat. Go to a poetry writing workshop. Read any of the innumerable books about, you know, here's some ideas for how to write a poem. Sign up for an online workshop if you need that. But you actually don't need that, because you have heard and been exposed to poems all your life. Your parents sang you lullabies. You've listened to song lyrics. You know what a poem is already. And so, an easy way to start is with something like Pebbles or haiku, because it's short. And I always say it's much too hard to write one, because then you'll think it has to be good. Write 10. Get the basic rules for haiku. 3 lines, something from the natural world, and a season indication, because that tells you that change is always with us, transience is always with us. If the poem says it's spring, some part of you knows that it will be winter someday. If the poem says it's winter, summer will eventually come. So, a cricket for autumn, a snowflake. Just look around you, write 3 lines, but pause a little to hear what is going to follow the initial observation. And when you strike some deeper understanding, you will just feel it. You don't have to be able to explain it. You will just feel it. Or do 10-minute free writes. Find the path that works for you. People work differently. Listen to the murmur of your inner ear, your inner voice. And sometimes it changes. Sometimes your inner voice is just chattering about what you're going to make for dinner. And sometimes it deepens and changes. I would advise, don't do this while you're meditating, because if I had not, put a vow of intention on my zazen that I was not going to write poems in zazen, I would have spent my 3 years at the monastery writing poems in zazen and not doing zazen. But it is a feeling close to whatever kind of meditation. I assume anybody listening to this talk has a meditation practice. You could, at a different time, a different schedule in the day, say, now I am going to enter that deepened, quiet awareness that I already know I can find my way through because I have a meditation practice. And this time I'm going to invite words and I'm going to listen. And when they begin to come, I will allow myself to write them down. That's a start. I used to teach a summer workshop at Tassajara every other year for many years, and I would invite everybody to that. But guest season has changed at Tassajara, and I'm not sure that I will ever be back doing that particular thing again. But there are so many gates. Just walk through any of them, or read a poet you love, and then listen and see if some murmuring begins in your ear. That's how many people sort of prime themselves for writing. Doesn't work with everything. I can't read Emily Dickinson before writing because her rhythms are so strong and her voice is so distinctive, and I don't want to write imitation Emily Dickinson poems. But there are other poets who, when I read them, they just make me want to write. W.S. Merwin, Adrian Rich, Galway Cannell, Czesław Miłosz, Wisława Szymborska, Cavafy. They make me want to write. And so I might read them and then see and then listen.
Thank you so much, Jane. I feel like this evening is probably inspiring to many to write some poems. And our time is coming to a close soon. We will end this evening with a poem that Jane will read. But before she does, I wanted to say a little bit about the practice of dana. Dana is a word from classical South Asian languages such as Sanskrit and Pali that are important in Buddhist traditions. And it refers to the first virtue of the Bodhisattva, as it is both the relinquishing of that to which we might be attached and also meets the immediate needs of others. It's etymologically related to our word donation, but it has a much more expansive meaning. And I think of it as including our practice of ethics, of attending to others in the world, of kindness, certainly of generosity. And one meaning as practiced here at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies is the sense of generosity that leads teachers to offer their teaching freely, in this case Jane, without a contract, trusting in the generosity of the Sangha, of the participants to support them. And personally, I find this a deeply inspiring practice in our world where so much is monetized, where so many people understand themselves as entrepreneurs. That's one way of thinking of the neoliberal culture. We're all entrepreneurs. The practice of dana and offering freely is a kind of alternative to neoliberal capitalism. And I think if there's a figure in this world who is an alternative to that, it's the poet. Jane has led a life devoted to poetry and practice starting in her 20s. And I personally find that very moving, a life devoted to attending to beauty. It's a rich life, though I've never heard anybody recommend going into poetry as a way to become rich. And yet, everyone needs to pay for housing and books of poetry and healthcare. So I'm deeply grateful to everyone who already offered dana when you registered. And if you're in a life situation where offering dana in this way doesn't make sense, I trust you offered dana generously in many other ways, and I don't want you to feel pressure. And if you're so moved, I believe that Mindy has put a link in the chat to offer dana, which will be shared with Jane and then also the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, which is supported in large part by donations. So thank you so much, Jane, and maybe we could end with a poem, and maybe you could read it twice, just to let it sink in.
Well, okay. In that case, you get the really short one. So this is the Pebble I didn't read earlier, and it is a poem of confidence against despair, because I know so many people now are struggling with the risk of despair. So personal life, larger cultural life. So first reading. Opening the hands between here and here. On the dark road, only the weight of the rope, yet the horse is there. Second reading. Opening the hands between here and here. On the dark road, only the weight of the rope, yet the horse is there. I have so enjoyed speaking with you, William, and all who have gathered with us in silence. Thank you for being here. And I wish you a lovely evening. I wish you glimpses of beauty in the dark.